Good day, everyone. My name is Rebecca Lilly for the International Association of Energy Economics. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar entitled Climate Change Policies, Lessons from Europe. We're grateful to our moderator, Anna Credi, and distinguished speakers for today's timely discussion. First, a little bit about the International Association for Energy Economics. We are the largest association specializing in the field of energy economics and provide a forum for the exchange of ideas, experience, and issues among professionals interested in the field. The organization produces 2 professional journals, a newsletter, and provides and holds conferences and virtual presentations along with a host of other products and services that you can find at our website at www.iaee.org. If you're not already a member of the association, we welcome you to join. A few housekeeping matters in regard to today's webinar before I hand things over to our moderator. First, this webinar is being recorded for those that cannot participate in today's live event. If you have questions for the panelists, please click the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom window and type your question. We've allocated time at the end of the webinar to read and answer them. And now I would like to introduce you to our moderator. Anna Credi is a full professor at University of Paris Dauphine and director of the Climate Economics Chair and Economics of Gas Chair at Dauphine University. Anna, over to you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Thank you for hosting this webinar to the International Association of Energy Economics. Today, I have the pleasure of discussing some issues about climate change policies in Europe in the midst of turmoil that we are experiencing about what we call actually the energy crisis, which is hitting, by the way, many markets in the world, but more particularly what is happening in Europe. Nevertheless, we have some long-term commitments. That is what Europe is putting in place towards the goal of the carbon neutrality in 2050. And the big issue that we have today is that the energy crisis is perhaps somehow shifting over this objective to beat climate change. So what we want to, our point today is to recall what is actually in place and how this works, or it is supposed to do the job, and which are the latest development in carbon regulation, let's say, in Europe. So I'm going to give the floor first to Marc Baudry. So Marc Baudry is a colleague of mine, and he works at Paris Nanterre University, and he leads at the Climate Economic Chair the research program on carbon markets and low carbon innovation. So the 4 of us, we are working together at the Climate Economic Chair. So we will have the opportunity to speak a lot about what we are doing in research. Marc is going to point out some specificities of what it is called the flagship instruments of regulation, environmental regulation in Europe, that is the European trading system for carbon quotas, and how it is evolving in the last year. Marc, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Anna. I will try to highlight how it is important to discuss the recent reforms of the EU-ETS in line with a question that primarily seems to be quite strange, which is to determine whether the EU-ETS can send a credible signal for decarbonizing the European economy. Actually, this question may be strange or seems to be strange because, as you probably know, an emission trading system is by essence a regulation by quantities. It puts a cap on emissions so that the targeted level of emission is necessarily respected. Moreover, this question may also seem strange given the recent surge that we observe since approximately 2 years in the carbon price. But actually, this question makes sense if we try to distinguish between 2 types of emission reduction. On the one hand, regulated firms may reduce their emission in the short term with just adapting or by just adapting their production level. And on the other hand, they can choose to curb their emission in the long term by adopting low carbon technologies and making some investment in low carbon technologies. And actually, what we have in mind when we speak about decarbonizing the European economy is a second type of emission reduction. And if we try to assess whether the EU ETS succeeded in boosting this kind of emission, we can try to test it by different strategies. For instance, we can just, in a simple way, look at the dynamics of energy intensity of regulated firms. We can also try to implement some more developing methods. For instance, as a climate economic share, we implemented estimation and calibration of production frontier in order to assess what was actually the carbon intensity and the laissez-faire emission level of firms. And whether you use the first simple type of measure or this more elaborated strategy, we have to we observe that conclusions are rather pessimistic. And it seems that firms didn't actually implement or didn't make many investments in low carbon technologies. And the question is how to explain this result. And for this purpose, of course, we can make a use, or for instance, of the reduction theory applied to investment. And this theory highlights that it's not just the level of a key variable for the profitability of investments, in our case, the price of carbon, it's not even the expected trajectory of this key variable that only matters for inducing investment. It's also the uncertainty, the volatility of this variable. And it means that we probably have to discuss whether the recent reform of the EU ETS have reduced or not reduced this volatility of the carbon price. To do so, of course, I will focus more specifically on the major reform implemented during these last years, which is the inception of the market stability reserve. But prior discussing this implication of the market stability reserve, I would like to briefly review some basic characteristics of the European Union emission trading system and probably of most of the existing ETS around the world. We have to keep in mind that the European emission trading system is based on the principle of a carbon budget not to be exceeded. Indeed, it's considered that from a climate point of view, what is important is that the cumulated emission of greenhouse gases do not exceed a tipping point above which catastrophic changes of the climate system would occur. And in a climate point of view, it doesn't matter what is the exact time path of emission as long as we do not reach this tipping point. It has major implication in the way we are in the design of an emission trading system. More specifically, it has been shown that if we want to not to exceed this tipping point at least cost, we have to introduce intertemporal flexibility in the carbon market, in the sense that we have to let regulated firms choose when to do their effort or how to allocate their abatement effort through time. A direct consequence of this intertemporal flexibility in the abatement decision is that both the abatement decision, but also the price and the price dynamics of the carbon allowances, carbon emission allowances, will crucially depend on expectation made by regulated firms. Of course, this is not specific to a carbon market, but what makes it more specific is that this market is actually a market where the supply of allowances is under the very direct control of public authorities. And it makes the carbon market probably more comparable to the interbank market, for instance, than to a standard commodity market. It also means that the price level and the trajectory of the carbon price are very sensitive to regulatory uncertainty. And this is a key point I want to discuss, going back now to the market stability reserve. We can say that the market stability reserve has reached one of its first goals, which was to boost the price dynamic on the EU ETS, but the fact that it also lead or resulted in less volatile carbon price is probably more questionable. To understand this, remember that the market stability reserve is based on an automatic operation which withdraws allowances from the market when the total number of allowances in circulation exceeds the maximum threshold. And conversely, it puts allowances back on the market when the total number of allowances in circulation falls below a minimum threshold. In addition, from 2023, it will also permanently withdraw from the market the amount of allowances in excess of what was auctioned during the previous year. So the second mechanism will clearly result in a tightening of the total quantity of allowances supplied. But the academic literature has also stressed that even the first mechanism, the one based on these two thresholds, can, under certain conditions that have been discussed in the literature, also contribute to boost the carbon price level and to affect its dynamic. But our point is not just to discuss whether this mechanism has generated increasing trend in the carbon price. It's rather to discuss whether it has reduced the volatility or increased the volatility of the carbon price. And to go back to this point, we can just highlight that just when this at the inception of the market stability reserve, the European Union stressed that it was an automatic system. And the idea that was that because it was ruled by automatic resale or automatic withdrawing of allowances, it was highly predictable by regulated firms. Or said another way, the key idea was that the system was intrinsically not subject to regulatory uncertainty. But actually, if we look at the very recent debate about this market stability reserve, we can unfortunately conclude that we are going another way currently. More specifically, there are ongoing discussions to resell allowances put in the market stability reserve to finance the RePowerEU plan, which is implemented in response to the energy crisis and the deep increase in the price of gas and the price of oil. But typically, trying to finance this RePowerEU plan by a kind of discretionary decision to resell allowances that have been put in the MSR is a typical discretionary decision. And we can imagine that if we allow such kind of financing of RePowerEU, it means that in a quite near future, policymakers will be able to use the MSR as a tip pocket each time they need financing of the kind of policies. And as a result, firms will anticipate that in addition to random shocks that are inherent to any market, there is also a risk of sudden drop in the price of carbon due to discrete decision to resell allowances put in the MSR. And so there is a risk to increase regulatory uncertainty. And if we go back to the analysis of low carbon investments, there is a risk that if a firm decides to realize a low carbon investment, it may reveal to be ex post unprofitable if during the time the investment is made, public policy decides to use the funds from reselling allowances in the MSR to finance another policy. And clearly, this will constitute a disincentive to realize such investments. So I think that we are at a turning point in the way we define climate policy, and not specifically, or we define or the EU ETS is managed. And this discussion suggests that we should rather rely on rules than on discretion. It does not mean that we do not advise public deciders to finance some policies with the funds raised from auctioning, for instance, carbon allowances. But what we want to stress in this discussion is that when using such revenues, we have to rely on rules, like does, for instance, the Innovation Fund, which is financed by auctioning EU ETS allowances, but on the basis of a rule that explicitly define how many allowances can be auctioned to finance the Innovation Fund. So I hope that with this quite short discussion, I have sufficiently highlighted what are the ongoing stakes of the EU ETS and all this the carbon market regulation has to be clearly designed to promote low carbon innovation and low carbon investments.
Thank you, Marc. Just some perhaps factual questions that can help our audience to understand which is the crucial points also in this policy. Clearly, as you have underlined, the commitment is a key point. Just to give a clue to the audience, how much is the CO2 ton today traded in Europe?
The price of credit, the price of credit allowances was some months ago, even in August, it was between 80 and 90 euros per ton of carbon. But very recently, since about 2 weeks, it has dropped and it's now about 70 euros per ton. And clearly, it seems that this drop is highly correlated with this discussion I mentioned about the resale of allowances that should initially not be resold by the Market Stability Reserve, but which are subject to this potentially discretionary decision to resell allowances. So it means that market actors are anticipating that there will be an oversupply, potentially an oversupply allowances due to this decision to resell allowances to finance the RePowerEU plan.
Yes, at the same time, Europe needs actually we are at the, again, the trade-off. Europe needs money to finance all the policies that are under the RePowerEU, and clearly they are trying to make this, to soften also the way in which the budget is going to be constrained by RePowerEU. Not to mention that it is something quite drastic that you have not included in your questioning about what is going on in the EU-ETS, but there is also some quite strange and I think extreme position such that the EU-ETS should be suspended during the energy crisis, which should, I mean, this is the worst scenario that is going to really discourage low carbon innovation.
Yeah, but there are also other strategy to soften the current crisis without suspending the EU ETS. And in some way, as European Union already planned some devices to soften the consequences of high energy prices. I most specifically think about the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is a way to modify the disadvantage in competition that regulated firms, European regulated firms, may face when they are covered by the EU ETS, in sectors covered by the EU ETS, compared to extra EU competitors. And I rather suggest to put in place a carbon border adjustment mechanism, even if we can discuss whether it's fully efficient or not, but obviously it would soften this kind of exogenous shocks as the one we know nowadays with this very high price of gas and high price of fuel, rather than suspending the EU ETS.
Totally agree with you, because we don't know how this will be perceived by all the regulated firms. Just to recall that we have, let's say, half of the sectors, half of the European economy, which is covered by the EU ETS.
We can also soften a little bit more the EU ETS by, for instance, postponing another reform that goes hand in hand with the inception of a carbon border adjustment mechanism. I think it's easier, for instance, to delay the decision to suppress free allocation of allowances rather than deciding to stop the EU ETS. I think it's easier to delay an ongoing reform rather than to suppress a key policy tool that has been put in place since now more than 15 years.
Totally agree. So thank you, Marc. We will perhaps go back to some consideration about it. And now I would like to give the floor to Philippe Delacote. Philippe is also leading one of the research programs at the Climate Economic Chair based on agricultural and forest economics. So what the founder of the Climate Economic Chair called it the carbon which is alive in our economies. And he is going to explain another way to understand carbon offsetting. That is what happens at the firm level, like a voluntary engagement. So you all have in mind the examples of many firms, and by the way, the big, even the big American firms like Amazon, they are within this carbon pledge commitment, which is one of the programs that should ensure that firms commit to have zero net emissions. So, Philippe, do we have to trust this kind of announcement?
Thank you, Anna. Hello, everyone, for being here. yeah, as you were saying just before, not all sectors are considered in carbon markets like the EU-ETS, but some of them have important contribution to climate change. And moreover, their transition to cleaner production, they require some fundings, and sometimes quite large fundings. At the same time, as you mentioned, Anna, some private firms in their own strategies toward carbon neutrality, they want to compensate their residual emissions by possibly funding some emission reductions somewhere else in other sectors. So for some of you, for instance, who still take the plane, and when you buy plane tickets, sometimes the device asks you, well, do you want to compensate your emissions? So what does it mean? Usually it means that the company to which you are buying your ticket is buying some carbon credits on offsetting or voluntary carbon markets to compensate for their for the emissions of your flight. So the volume behind those markets is quite growing. In the middle of the 2000s, it was virtually zero, and it reached about 250 million tons of CO2 last year. So it's really a large increase in the exchange of those types of carbon credits. So once again, between private firms willing to take the road of carbon neutrality and projects that need funding to reduce their own emissions. Within Europe and within the Green New Deal, there is applied to agriculture and forestry the farm to fork strategy, in which there is a carbon farming initiatives that wants to incentivize farmers to reduce their climate impact and to increase carbon sequestration in agricultural soil. And this carbon farming initiative is really framed basically also like this type of offsetting mechanism. So today I'm going to talk quickly about the supply side of offsetting, of the demand side, and I will quickly have a focus on what is the impact really of those type of credits. So on the supply side of those credits, I will take the case of agriculture and forestry. Why? Simply because they are not explicitly considered into most carbon markets. While, for instance, agriculture is a very important contributor to climate change. In Europe, for instance, about between 10 and 15% of CO2 emissions, of greenhouse gas emissions, come from agriculture. Agriculture and forestry, they are also important carbon sinks. So forests, trees, when they grow, and agricultural soil, they sequester a lot of carbon, and so they help withdrawing some carbon of the atmosphere. So they are quite important sectors when it deals to climate change mitigation. And the ecological transition of those sectors require quite important fundings. So when we talk about offsetting projects in agriculture and forestry, you might think, for instance, of projects to reduce tropical deforestation, project for reforestation, so planting new forests and increase the carbon stock. You can consider also projects to incentivize changes of agricultural practices toward less environmental impacts. So basically what determines here the participation of stakeholders, or the participation of farmers or forest managers. First, there is the cost of practical change. How much does it cost to change my behavior toward a more environmental friendly behavior? A crucial question that arises also is that do we target some incremental change or some transformational change? I will take a simple example in agriculture. If we consider the crops fertilization, you can, with a simple carbon price, decrease fertilization, and this can be considered as incremental change. So you just change the quantity of some input in your system. In contrast, you can imagine some very much more transformational change in which, for instance, you put some legumes into your crops rotation, and here it's a much more ambitious change that has to be implemented, and obviously the costs are necessarily not the same whether you have one type of change or the other. So that's also an important thing to have in mind. And first and foremost, there is the opportunity cost behind those new practices. For instance, if we focus on avoided deforestation project, what really determines the outcome is the opportunity cost of deforestation is how much would have earned the farmers if he or she converts some forests to agriculture. If we go back a few years back in the Stern report, it was mentioned at the time that, for instance, avoided deforestation was one of the cheapest options to mitigate climate change, because Professor Stern really focused on the opportunity cost of deforestation, saying that, well, most deforestation is due to low productivity farming, and so it would be easy to compensate those farmers to reduce their deforestation activity. Well, we came back from this statement because there are also some important transaction costs and so behavioral barriers to overcome. But nevertheless, there is room here to raise fundings and to try to target new behaviors into agriculture and forestry. On the other side of the market, there is the demand for offsetting. So here we consider, as Anna was saying, some voluntary action by firms who wants to go on the path of carbon neutrality. So offsetting or carbon compensation is really supposed to be like the last step of the road toward neutrality, meaning that those firms are supposed at first to think about implementing a strategy to reduce their own emissions, and then and only then to try to compensate for their residual emissions. A point that arises here is that at what price do we set those types of carbon offsetting? An important feature here is that carbon offsetting is voluntary. So it's supposed that both buyers and suppliers of carbon credits and voluntary carbon markets, they both win from the trade. So it has an advantage. It is more acceptable to the stakeholders. It's likely that it increased participation of agricultural stakeholders and of private firms. But there is a drawback to that, which is there enough ambition behind those type of offsetting? Or do we only focus on the low-hanging fruits and with basically little impact? So that's something that I will talk about a bit later, about the impact of those carbon offsets. A first result here is that a PhD thesis that was done at the chair a few years back by Gabriela Simone. She showed that the fundings from carbon offsettings, for instance, to avoided deforestation project, was only one part of the funding that is required to reduce deforestation, but that was never sufficient to fully fund an avoided deforestation project. So that's the first type of result that we have, is that usually there is quite a too low price from carbon offsetting to agricultural and forestry sectors to really fund and to really trigger the change. If we look at the broader picture, if we look at the overall data on prices, the price of carbon on those markets is quite low. So I was just looking at the ecosystem marketplace website just a few hours back, and they were saying that the average price of carbon offsets last year was about less than €5 per ton. So that's really a low price and not enough, once again, to fund most projects. Nevertheless, there is a large variety of prices. There is no unique price on those markets, but every credit is sold on the counter between one seller and one supplier. So there is a large variety of prices on those markets. One type of explanation that explains this price heterogeneity is the case of carbon co-benefits from agriculture and forestry projects. So behind co-benefits, we mean that within agricultural and forest ecosystem, there is not only carbon, but there is also biodiversity. They are related to rural poverty in many cases. There is a case of climate resilience that is quite important. And so some projects have the ambition not only to increase carbon sequestration or to decrease carbon emission, but also to have a positive impact on co-benefits. So for instance, I reduce deforestation, which is good for keeping the carbon sink in place. But at the same time, I also help to conserve biodiversity, and I also help local farmers to increase their livelihoods. And we showed some years ago that the price, for instance, of avoided deforestation project was sold at a higher price than other types of carbon offsets on those type of markets. And with a few interviews, both on buyers of carbon credit, we had this intuition that there was some value given to co-benefits on those type of markets. So that's one of the explanation behind this price variety, which is the fact that co-benefits, they are valued by the markets. One of the big question behind those carbon offsetting markets was raised by Anna just before I start talking, which is, well, does it work? Can we find any impact, any additionality of those projects? So behind this concept of additionality, we have can we see a reduction of emission that can be attributed to the project that created those carbon credits? If we look at the literature, at the economic literature, and that the impact analysis literature on those offsets credits, we have a large variety of impacts. Some projects we can't prove that there are impacts on carbon emissions. In some projects we can find a positive effect. So we'll just give here one example of a study that we performed a few months back. We evaluated 6 avoided deforestation projects in the Amazon, and we used a matching and difference approach. So basically, the idea is to compare before after deforestation level within a project and within areas that are the most similar as possible as where the project is implemented. We compared 2 types of projects. One type of project only focus on carbon sequestration, so they only certify that the project reduce carbon emissions. Other project, they focus both on carbon emissions, but also on improving the farmer's livelihood in the neighborhood. What we show is that in many projects, there is what we can call a location bias. That is a project, they are implemented in location where forests are not necessarily threatened. So for instance, when we talk about location bias, we mean projects that are implemented far away from roads, far away from agricultural pressure. And so in this case, additionality is difficult to prove. Like maybe there is no deforestation, but probably there is no deforestation because there is no agricultural pressure. So there is this first result that in some cases we find some evidence of those location bias in avoided deforestation projects. Furthermore, what we show is that for 5 out of 6 projects, we can't find any positive impact of the projects on deforestation. So this raised this question that was raised by Anna just before, which is, well, does it really work? Of course, there is a question of external validity of our study, but if we focus on the 6 projects that we evaluated, only one of them out of 6 for which we can prove some additionality, so for which we can prove that it's indeed decreased deforestation. This result, it raised quite an important question about carbon certification, because within those projects, the carbon, some private and third-party certifiers certified that indeed the project could could sell carbon credit on voluntary markets. So probably we don't have the information and the data about that, but probably some carbon credits were sold on offset markets related to those projects. But for 5 of them, we can't find any evidence of reduced emissions through reduced deforestation. So that's really a question that needs to be further addressed. And there are 2 main research, I will finish with that. There are 2 main research questions, I think, on which we should target in the near future, which is what determines really, what are the factors influencing the price of exchange of those offsets on voluntary carbon markets? The first one. And the second one is, what are really the factors that can help explaining why some projects do work to reduce emissions and some projects don't really work. So trying to find what are the sources of heterogeneity between additionality of projects that are aimed to produce carbon offsets. I'm done. So
thank you. Yes, thank you, Philippe. I think that if we compare what Marc was explaining about the European trading system and this market, the international market for carbon offset, one question that may be of interest also for our audience is that is there any evidence in this voluntary market that European firms, since they are used also to have this carbon trading or this carbon regulation, are leading this market, or the other way around, is firms that comes for a quite unregulated environment, as it is the case for the United States?
That's a good question. I don't have the proper figures or data in mind, but to my understanding, there are both types of firms. For instance, big energetic firms, they are really interested into those type of offsetting, even if they have to be actors of the EU-ETS, for instance. But you have also firms, I think, that anticipate that at some point they will have to show that they are clean enough, and so by anticipating and by showing. So some people would say and sometimes it's maybe related to greenwashing, but some firms, they try to get in advance because they feel that some regulation will come eventually. So I would say both.
Yeah, thank you for this clarification. And then we switch. You have introduced the firms in the energy market. This will be an issue discussed also by our third speaker, Olivier Massol. Olivier is leading the research area at the Climate Economic Chair on energy transition. And he will talk about another point that is actually struggling Europe in the energy crisis, which is the potential for demand reduction. So just to introduce the topic, we are working in Europe with scenarios that are going to encourage, and this is really the term because we don't have any kind of, for the moment, any regulation that is very stringent, but we want to encourage strong demand decrease both of gas and actually also electricity is being discussed. But how do we stand with this idea of managing demand? So, Olivier.
Many thanks, Anna, for the opportunity to give a presentation for what we are doing in this research program. So, well, it's fair to say that, well, overall, this program is aimed at analyzing the specific functioning of energy system and the way energy systems are affected by the global energy transition. And it's as a first step, maybe as a forward, I wanted to emphasize that basically we all know that we have a long-run trend towards electrification. It's true in developing countries, in developed nations. And what we try to do in this research program is basically to try to analyze what drives these trends and how we can further strengthen the decarbonization of existing power system, or try to avoid that the new power systems that are going to be installed, especially in developing nations, opt for carbon-intensive technologies. So How can we go green? Of course, we all have in mind that it means incorporating a larger share of carbon neutral generation technologies, nuclear, hydro, wind, solar, and that these technologies, especially for the last two ones, have their own issues about when we talk about non-dispatchability and the problem of intermittency that goes with it, and that coping with a RES-dominated system is a challenging task that is clearly asked in Europe these days, especially when we are talking about what is the imminent energy crisis. But it's also very true in the long run as well when we try to think about what are the business models that can be used by the players, by the generation companies, when they are somehow frightened by the possibility to have marginal costs of electricity generation falling, drastically affecting their profitabilities in the short run, and thus affecting the possibility to have investment. So what we try to do in this program is try to somehow think about how policies, infrastructures, technologies, behaviors somehow coexist and affect the market outcomes, and how we can somehow we can take action on one of the other aspects to analyze that. So luckily we have a host of technologies that can be envisioned. It's fair to say that in the profession as a whole, energy economists have spent a lot of time in the recent years to discuss about possible technological solution to what is to this problem by looking at what are the potential for, let's say, hydrogen or biomass fuel generation or hybrid or batteries or vehicle to grid, and how the incorporation of these new technologies might affect the economics of the power system and might somehow soften or alleviate the difficulties to cope with wind and solar and intermittent sources. Let's say, I mean, the goal of the program is basically to try to, for each of these technologies, to try to see what are the exact potential, how it affects the market outcomes, whether some IO aspects may affect as well the price formation and the market outcomes. And so to analyze that, to illustrate that, I've decided to hope to give you a brief presentation of a recent work that has been conducted at the chair, and to show you how exactly we try to analyze that by combining some sound engineering-based analysis of technology combined with an economic representation. So far, we have noticed that there is a large, for example, when you talk about demand response, as you clearly pointed at, so we have noticed that there exists a very large literature in system engineering that examines the economics of RES-dominated system, but using usually a supply-side perspective that omits the potential for demand response. And yet, the recent news have shown that, well, demand response will be somehow needed, and that still there may be some potential that can be mobilized, either by canceling load. At times, of course, we have to cancel load when we have to curtail some curtailments that are imposed, but we may think also that these load shedding capabilities could be adequately mobilized in the future, so that to somehow cope with the system and lower the system cost, and that maybe it could be valuable to think about incorporating those capabilities in the system. And this load shedding capabilities, they exist in many cases when we talk about cooling appliances, when we talk about steel and iron sectors, pulp and paper mills, cemeteries, and so on. Another thing that we could think about is another option that we could think about is load shifting. Of course, load shifting is something that people who are working on EVs have in mind when they think about mobilizing these fleets of electric vehicles that will be connected to the grid and trying to control their charge and discharge, so as to somehow alleviate peaking on the system. So that's clearly something that can be mobilized, but there are other possibilities, and we could think at cool or cooling system or heating system that could be also controlled in such a manner and somehow provide some system benefits. So what are these system benefits? How can we model them? How can they contribute to the system? That's something that we try to do, and we have been privileged during this year to work with a series of talented scholars. I have in mind Julien Ancel and Ange Blanchard, especially lately we did a remarkable internship at the chair focusing on the application of operation research technique to try to model that and provide a new perspective on that. So typically the point of departure that we have decided to look at is to opt for a hydropower viewpoint. This hydropower viewpoint is not ours. It was already developed by someone else whose name was Antoine Verrier in a doctoral dissertation in Dauphine in 2018. And this hydropower viewpoint consists basically at looking at the potential for organizing load shading and seeing that as a reservoir of negative generation that we could somehow use along the course of a given year. But of course, we have a limited potential because we cannot curtail consumption during the entire year. So we have to use it wisely, just as we do with a dam. When we have hydropower reservoir, we have a dam and we have to use somehow the water in the reservoir in a wise manner. Load shifting is a bit the same. We can have a slightly more complex representation based on a sequence of reservoirs, such as one that exists in pump storage. And the goal is basically here to have this representation for load shifting that is either preponing or postponing consumption over time, as in pump storage, and whether it works and it can be associated with a potential. And by doing so, we have basically agglomerated and aggregated all of the potential that exists in the various subsectors, in the industries, in households, and try to, using this hydropower viewpoint, try to model that, the optimal use of those potential and see whether they can have an effect on the market outcomes. And so to do so, of course, when we think about hydropower, we have to think about how to use these resources wisely. So that's why we have to use an operation research perspective by thinking about how mobilizing this resource across time or over the course of a given year, or given representative year, which means that it has clearly a dynamic programming perspective, because we have a finite stock that we have to use optimally. And this question then has deep roots in economics, go back to Hoteling or to the earlier work of Bellman on dynamic programming. We can think also in terms of stochastic, introducing some stochastic elements, because obviously we don't know exactly what will be the temperature at the end of the year. We don't know exactly what will be the heating demand at the end of the year, and thus demand for power, for space heat. So typically those aspects is there on the demand side or on the supply side by incorporating some uncertainty on power generated by solar and windmills, solar panel and windmills, provide us with a rich framework to somehow see how these resources can be mobilized over time and how they contribute. So we did that by applying some technique which is named the stochastic dynamic programming technique. It's out of the scope of the current presentation. But what I find interesting is the fact that basically when we look and compare the outcomes using the same calibration as did other famous forecasters, such as, for example, the foresight analysis that are conducted by the French TSO RTE, who is in charge of issuing long-run scenarios for the French system and comparing the outcomes when they include demand response or not. We see that basically incorporating the potential for demand resource, or even a tiny portion of this demand potential of this demand response capabilities, is sufficient to slightly modify, to substantially modify the system and the way the system will be operated. And we found that basically demand response can drastically lower the need to use polluting backup generation, especially open cycle gas turbines. So it can have a drastic effect on lowering CO2 emitted at peak hours. And when we find that there is a factor of 3, depending on whether demand response is allowed or not on these scenarios. We found that, of course, it has a drastic impact in reducing peak hours, especially in future power system where we know that the price of electricity will be greater than the one we have experienced in the previous years. This is something that is relevant and it is valuable to see that to observe that market price at peak hours can be reduced. And of course, that we'll find also that demand response can contribute to security of supply by reducing the number of hours in a given year during which we will have curtailment, imposed curtailment. This is also something that is valuable and that is now seriously considered in France, given the current news. Okay, so also something which is interesting from this work is that behind the technicalities and the analysis, what is interesting is that it can be used to derive very interesting insights regarding the business model associated with these new activities, that is aggregating demand response and trying to put it on a system. And that's something interesting because it provides interesting insights as to what sources of demand response will be could be developed independently by an aggregator without any support, but it also shows that a private aggregator may not be necessarily in a situation where he will develop all the whole potential of demand response, which some also ask for question for either controlling that this activity is not supplied by a single operator. Otherwise, we may have the risk of having this type of market power issues that may have already been pointed in the case of energy storage, for example, by our colleague Ramtin Soshansi at Ohio State University. But we also think in terms of deployment that maybe an oligopoly controlled demand aggregation will not necessarily be developed up to the point where it's socially valuable. So that's our issue that we have to take on and to continue working on, so as to nurture the policy debates on demand response on this. And it's clearly an ongoing and fierce policy debate on this. Well, these are the points I wanted to bring to the table. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, Olivier. That's a question that, of course, is very relevant in the actual context. My impression is that, well, as you have underlined, the issue has been brought at the same time when we have started looking at competitive electricity market, in which there was this challenge of making the demand less inelastic somehow. But my impression is that both on the research side and also on the policy side, this lever has been a little bit neglected during the last 15 years. And somehow we are not prepared to deploy really a policy of demand response. And of course, when the example you are giving us is especially for big consumers. And the idea is that load shedding or load shifting is something that is going to endanger firms. Instead, is a source of energy efficiency, right? So is that the case that this potential benefit of demand response has been underestimated in modern electricity markets, and especially in Europe, of course?
Oh, clearly it has been underestimated, but it's also something which is, there's also a reason why it's worth having a look at also on the way to represent it in systems. Because when we had a very interesting informal discussion with our colleagues from RT, they're doing a very good job at representing the system and trying to plan it and to incorporate that. But it's fair to say also that incorporating, the optimal operation of these tools within the complex system that incorporate both, a detailed representation of the entire power system, both from a generation side, the transmission side, is also complex. And it's something that I have a hard time doing just because the complexity is real. And so there is room for somehow deepening our understanding of this of the functioning of demand response, so that it can be properly incorporated also in this long-term models. I'm not saying that they're not incorporating it. The way I'm saying, the point I'm making is basically that so far it has been done usually using ad hoc rules on, we're going to use that, we can posit some patterns of use along the year and we can use it and mobilize them adequately. But it will be much preferable to use them, as an option that we can mobilize also as an alternative to investment, sometimes in some certain type of asset, which is not the way it's done for the moment. So probably it's also due to the fact that we have some past dependency to the way we have seen power system during many years. And I cannot help thinking that this has to be revised if we want to understand exactly how this new technology can change that and how we should incorporate them in the way we see the power system and model it.
I guess that we will be obliged to do so given the actual level of price of both electricity and gas in Europe. So thank you, Philippe, Marc, and Olivier for giving this overview. which represents kind of 3 samples of the research that we carry out at the Climate Economic Chair, that we can define like a research center or a platform open to all the aspects of the low carbon transition. So we carry out a research project, but also we give funding to PhD students and a research internship. So as a final say, I would like to invite you to visit our website and to keep in touch. We do a lot of publications, seminars, and we offer grants. So this may be of interest also for students that maybe are listening us. Thank you, everybody. And so, Rebecca, I give you the floor again to wrap up and conclude.
IAEE would like to thank Anna Credi and our distinguished speakers for an outstanding webinar. This webinar will be available on IAEE's website for future download. If you're not a member of IAEE, we encourage you to join by visiting www.iaee.org. We thank you for attending, and I officially close this webinar.